When world building is discussed in science fiction or fantasy stories, Dune isn't one of the first examples that immediately comes to mind. However, this isn't to say the world of Arrakis is completely lacking in that area, as the novels show a rich history within the narrative. This is especially since there are events that neither of the two Denis Villeneuve films touched upon, namely, the Butlerian Jihad. Taking place thousands of years before the main story, this holy war might initially seem like an obvious excuse to avoid tackling the concept of technological evolution in a futuristic story, but it's so much more. While this was the original intention, the idea evolved into a prequel story, which details the origins of what would eventually become one of the most iconic science fiction stories ever written. Excluding this story from the recent films may make some sense, due to the distraction it would pose to the main storyline, but not mentioning it entirely has consequences. Namely, it takes away the point it serves, providing relevant context that helps new audiences understand the world of Arrakis. Everything in Dune stems from the Butlerian Jihad. Despite the crucial history to the world in which he lives, the Butlerian Jihad is barely mentioned by Paul Atreides, Timothée Chalamet, during the main saga. Instead, it's used to answer an obvious question regarding the lack of sophisticated technology being developed in the far future. However, while the Butlerian Jihad was never explored in detail during the main Dune saga, author Brian Herbert continued the franchise's legacy after his father's death. There have been many prequel novels to the Dune series, but perhaps none have as much of a direct connection to the original book as the 3 books and Legends of Dune. Over the years, there's been no shortage of science fiction and fantasy stories depicting an ancient conflict from which the world of the present story originated. From the Rings of Power to House of the Dragon, Dune was among the first to explore this idea. However, the sheer number of prequel books and the fact that the original creator is not involved means that this aspect of the story fell by the wayside. This is a shame because it creates fascinating origin stories for the characters we know in the main saga and their adaptations. Conceding his inability to predict technological advances, Frank Herbert quite openly didn't even try. Considering these questions to be just a distraction from the actual story, he created an event meant to explain the absence of intelligent machines. By wiping his hands clean of this problem that so often plagues science fiction writers, Herbert avoided the question of technology and focused more on the themes that he deemed more important, including philosophy and mythology. This helped to create his epic tragedy about the downfall of an ancient imperial family and the dangers of having blind faith in messianic religious figures. If anything, the passage of time since the series was created has vindicated his position, as the technology we've developed in the 60 years since then could seem unbelievable, so imagine trying to apply it to a scale of millennia. Even in hard science fiction stories with great quality, that idea can still feel like a nuisance for those trying to create their own world. Although it might have started as nothing more than a pretext for removing undesirable elements from the main story. That does not make the Butlerian Jihad any less interesting or important. In a series that finally managed to get off the ground after one cinematic failure and numerous failed starts over the decades, it remains an unexplored story that could be of great interest to potential readers and even filmmakers. Villeneuve might be wrapping up his time on his Arrakis with a trilogy restricted to the main saga, but other prequel stories remain in production. Admittedly, the lore of Dune might not be quite as expansive as other franchises in similar genres, but there is still a lucrative amount to discover for those willing to look. Dune, Part 2 is now playing in theaters in the US.